Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
I'm going to read a sampling of my poems, which will be more or less chronological. I'm going to begin with the poem first poem I wrote that sort of made a noise. I wrote it when I was 25, when my son, my first child, was born. My son, my executioner. Whenever he's in the audience, I have to read it every time. When I wrote it with that title, I wondered what he would think about it when he got old enough. And then when he was 14, he said, "That poem you wrote about me when I was born, that's really more about your father and you, isn't it?" He'd been reading Freud again. My son, my executioner, I take you in my arms, quiet and small and just a stir, and whom my body warms. Sweet death, small son, our instrument of immortality, your cries and hungers document our bodily decay. We 25 and 22, who seemed to live forever, observe enduring life in you and start to die together. It made a noise because it was published in the New Yorker and then picked up by anthologies. So that for a long time, it was the one poem I had in most anthologies. It's outlived its life by this time. I want to read another poem, which I wrote not long after, but which is as different as a poem can be. That poem is written in iambic and it's rhyming. This poem is certainly not, and that poem is very rational, and this poem is certainly not. It's called The Long River. The musk ox smells in his long head, my boat coming. When I feel him there, intent, heavy, the oars make wings in the white night, and deep woods are close on either side, where trees darken. I rode past towns in their black sleep to come here. I passed the northern grass and cold mountains. The musk ox moves when the boat stops in hard thickets. Now the wood is dark with old pleasures. I have a gratitude to this poem because it's the first poem that I began and worked on without having any idea of what I was talking about. I had earlier the delusion that I should understand the poem before I wrote it. And every poem I wrote at that time that was any good really said something other than I had intended. And this poem had no question of intent. Let me read a poem about this kind of poem, written at about the same time. It's a poem called The Poem. It discovers by night what the day hid from it. Sometimes it turns itself into an animal. In summer it takes long walks by itself where meadows fold back from ditches. Once it stood still in a silent row of machines. Who knows what it is thinking? A poem that I wrote a little later that comes out of my father's death. And it's a poem that supplies the title of this selected poems. I wrote it, I had a dream a week after my father died, and I began to try to write about it right away. But I didn't finish this poem for, I think, 17 years. I had the poo part of the poem done, but it just didn't fly. And one day I was walking across the lawn of the house where I lived, and one line came into my head. Not on this subject necessarily, but it carried with it a little tag saying that it belonged with this poem. And that's the line that forms the title of my selected poems. White apples. When my father had been dead a week, I woke with his voice in my ear. I sat up in bed and held my breath and stared at the pale closed door. White apples and the taste of stone. If he called again, I would put on my coat and galoshes. It was the line, white apples and the taste of stone, that came into my head that time, syntactically not connected with the rest of the poem at all, but somehow, I think, giving it the power to take off the ground. At least I hope so. There's a poem I wrote quite a long time ago that I then, after writing the poem, I turned into a children's book. It's called Oxcart Man. This is not the children's book, this is the original story. Actually, I took it from a story told me by a New Hampshire neighbor whose eyes crinkled, and I knew he'd remembered the story. And he said, "Did you ever hear the one about the fellow who used to live around here? Every fall he loaded up his ox cart and drove it down to Portsmouth Market." I took off from there when he went on to tell me what happened. In October of the year, he counts potatoes dug from the brown field, counting the seed, counting the seller's portion out, and bags the rest on the cart's floor. He packs wool sheared in April, honey in combs, linen, leather tanned from deer hide, and vinegar in a barrel hooped by hand at the forge's fire. He walks by his ox's head 10 days to Portsmouth Market and sells potatoes and the bag that carried potatoes, flaxseed, birch brooms, maple sugar, goose feathers, yarn. When the cart is empty, he sells the cart. When the cart is sold, he sells the ox, harness and yoke, and walks home, his pockets heavy with the year's coin for salt and taxes. And at home, by fire's light, in November cold, stitches new harness for next year's ox in the barn, and carves the yoke and saws planks, building the cart again. It was when he told me that he sold the ox and walked home that I needed absolutely to make this into a poem. Human life renewed every year like a perennial plant, which will work for a while in your middle life at any rate. I'd like to read now my poem about poetry readings. There was a time when all poets were writing poems about poetry readings, but I don't, maybe we've used it up. This is a particular poetry reading, and it has a particular title, which is To a Waterfowl. James Russell Lowell wrote a poem called To a Waterfowl. I believe it was he. But in this case, the waterfowl occurs in the first line and then disappears forever. Women with hats like the rear ends of pink ducks applauded you, my poems. These are the women whose husbands I meet on airplanes, who close their briefcases and ask, "What are you in?" I look in their eyes. I tell them I'm in poetry. And their eyes filled with anxiety and with little tears. Oh yeah, they say, developing an interest in clouds. My wife, she likes that sort of thing. I guess maybe I'd better watch my grammar. I leave them in airports watching their grammar and take a limousine to the Women's Goodness Club, where I drink Harvey's Bristol cream with their wives and eat chicken salad with capers, with little tomato wedges, and I read them The Erotic Crocodile and Eating You. When I have concluded the disbursement of my sonorities, crooning, "High on thy thigh, I cry, hi," and so forth. They spank their wide hands, they smile like Jell-O, and they say, "My goodness, Mr. Hole, but you certainly do have an imagination." "Thank you indeed," I say. "It brings in the bacon." But now, my poems, now I have returned to the motel, returned to l'éternel retour of the Holiday Inn, naked, lying on the bed, watching Godzilla sucks Mount Fuji, addressing my poems, feeling superior, and drinking bourbon from a flask disguised to look like a transistor radio. And what about you? You laughing. You in the blue jeans, laughing at your mother who wears hats, and at your father who rides airplanes with a briefcase, watching his grammar. Will you ever be old and dumb like your creepy parent? Not you, not you, not you, not you, not you. That was a lot of fun to write. I remember when Gregor and I used to workshop together, doing this poem with him when I wrote it, and inventing Godzilla sucks Mount Fuji right in his presence, and we all laughed for 20 minutes. This is another rather different poem. I like to move by opposites. When I got back, when we moved to the farm in New Hampshire, I had already written a great deal about it. I haven't read you any of the earlier poems about it, but I went there as a kid in the summer to hay with my grandfather and spent the mornings working on poems while he was cutting the hay in the field, but then in the afternoon helped him raking after and pitching on with the old hay rack with one horse in front of it. I decided that when we moved back, I would have lost that subject. Living there, I wouldn't be able to write about it. I wrote a great deal about it. And I wrote about all the animals. And my favorite of one of the animals poems is one about the horses. It's called Names of Horses. All winter your brute shoulders strained against collars, padding and steerhide over the ash hames, to haul sledges of cordwood for drying through spring and summer, for the Glenwood stove next winter, and for the simmering range. In April you pulled cartloads of manure to spread on the fields, dark manure of Holsteins, and knobs of your own clustered with oats. All summer you mowed the grass in meadow and hayfield, the mowing machine clacketing beside you while the sun walked high in the morning. And after noon's heat, you pulled a clawed rake through the same acres, gathering stacks, and dragged the wagon from stack to stack and the built hayrack back uphill to the chaffy barn, 3 loads of hay a day hanging wide from the hayrack. Sundays, you trotted the 2 miles to church with the light load of a leather quarter-top buggy and grazed in the sound of hymns. Generation on generation, your neck rubbed the windowsill of the stall, smoothing the wood as the sea smooths glass. When you were old and lame, when your shoulders hurt bending to graze, one October the man who fed you and kept you and harnessed you every morning led you through corn stubble to sandy ground above Eagle Pond and dug a hole beside you where you stood shuddering in your skin, and laid the shotgun's muzzle in the boneless hollow behind your ear, and fired the slug into your brain, and felled you into your grave, shoveling sand to cover you, setting goldenrod upright above you, whereby next summer a dent in the ground made your monument. For 150 years, in the pasture of dead horses, roots of pine trees pushed through the pale curves of your ribs. Yellow blossoms flourished above you in autumn, and in winter, frost heaved your bones in the ground. Old toilers, soil makers. Oh, Roger, Mackerel, Riley, Ned, Nellie, Chester, Lady Ghost. It's too big a book. I have trouble fumbling around in it. I wrote a poem about a week after my father's death. There came a time, he died when he was only 52, and there came a time when I was approaching 52, and I found myself beginning poems not knowing what they were going to be for, but each of them was characterized by a sort of morbidity that I finally realized was the fact that I was approaching the death of the parent of the same sex. Some of you have had this happen. I mean, most people find it telling a kind of scary time. It's as if you didn't deserve to live longer than your father did or your mother did, or that you can't possibly do it. I wrote a poem called The Day I Was Older, which is in 5 parts, each of which are small parts, each of which has a title of its own. The clock. The clock on the parlor wall, stout as a mariner's clock, disperses the day. At night it tolls a half hour, and the hour's number with resolute measure, approaching the poles and crossing the equator over fathoms of sleep. Warm in the dark next to your breathing, below the 1,000 favored stars, I feel horns of gray water heave underneath us, and the ship's pistons pound as the voyage continues over the limited sea. The news. After tending the fire, making coffee, and pouring milk for cats, I sit in a blue chair each morning, reading obituaries in the Boston Globe for the mean age. Today there is Manufacturer Concord, 53, ex-Congressman Saugus, 80, and I read that Emily Farr is dead after a long illness in Oregon. Once in an old house we talked for an hour while a coal fire brightened in November twilight and wavered our shadows high on the wall until our eyes fixed on each other. 30 years ago. The pond. We lie by the pond on a late August afternoon as the breeze from low hills in the west stiffens water and agitates birch leaves yellowing above us. You set down your book and lift your eyes to white trunks tilting from shore. A mink scuds through ferns, an acorn tumbles. Soon we will turn to our daily business. You do not know that I am watching, taking pleasure in your breasts that rise and fall as you breathe. Then I see mourners gathered over an open grave. The day. Last night at supper time, I outlived my father, enduring the year, month, day, hour, and moment when he lay back on a hospital bed in the guest room, among cylinders of oxygen, mouth open, nostrils and pale blue lips fixed unquivering. Father of my name, father of long fingers, I remember your dark hair and your face almost unwrinkled. Now I have waked more mornings to frost whitening the grass, read the newspaper more times, and stood more times, my hand on a doorknob without opening the door. The cup, this is the last section. From the Studebaker's backseat on our Sunday drives, I watched her earrings sway. Then I walked uphill beside an old man carrying buckets under birches on an August day. Striding at noontime, I looked at wheat and at river cities. In the crib, my daughter sighed, opening her eyes. I kissed the cheek of my father dying. By the pond, an acorn fell. You listening here, you reading these words as I write them, I offer this cup to you. Though we drink from this cup every day, we will never drink it dry. I've written a certain number of poems which I printed quotation marks as a speech of somebody else. Dramatic monologues which aren't very dramatic by and large, but they're monologues. And this is one called Mr. Wakeville on Interstate 90. Now I will abandon the route of my life as my shadowy wives abandon me, taking my children. I will stop somewhere. I will park in a summer street where the days tick like metal into stillness. I will rent the room over Bert's Modern Barbershop where the "To Let" sign leans in a plate glass window, or I will buy the brown bungalow for sale. I will work 40 hours a week clerking at the paint store. On Fridays, I will cash my paycheck at Six Rivers Bank and stop at Harvey's Market and talk with Harvey. Walking on Maple Street, I will speak to everyone. At basketball games, I will cheer for my neighbors' sons. I will watch my neighbors' daughters grow up, marry, raise children. The joints of my fingers will stiffen. There will be no room inside me for other places. I will attend funerals regularly and weddings. I will chat with the mailman when he comes on Saturdays. I will shake my head when I hear of the florist who drops dead in the greenhouse over a flat of pansies. I spoke with her only yesterday. When lawyer elopes with babysitter, I will shake my head. When Harvey's boy enlists in the Navy, I will wave goodbye at the Trailways Depot with the others. I will vote Democratic. I will vote Republican. I will applaud the valedictorian at graduation and wish her well as she goes away to the university and weep as she goes away. I will live in a steady joy. I will exult in the ecstasy of my concealment. I called it Mr. Wakeville because Hawthorne has a story called Wakefield about a man who does something like this. Actually, within his own city, he moves to a different section of his city, changes his name and lives totally anonymously, having abandoned entirely his earlier life. And I imagine it is a fantasy, that it is a very common human fantasy to suddenly to disappear and become someone else. Finally, a poem called Olives. Now, I began to write poems when I was 12, and I got really serious when I was 14. It was 14 when I decided that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life, which then I went and did. But by that time, by 14, there was another element. I was a lousy athlete at school, and I wanted to do something to be interesting to young women. So I tried to pretend to be crazy. I was a poet. I was a mad poet, poet maudit. It didn't work. But there was a line that I said all the time to prove I was crazy. And it concerns olives in a way. Dead people don't like olives, I told my partners in 8th grade dancing class, who never listened as we foxtrotted 1, 2, 1, 2. The dead people I often consulted nodded their skulls in unison while I flung my black velvet cape over my shoulders and glowered from deep-set burning eyes, walking the city streets alone at 15, crazy for cheerleaders and poems. At Hamlin High football games, girls in short pleated skirts pranced and kicked, and I longed for their memorable thighs. They were friendly, poets were mascots, but never listened when I told them that dead people didn't like olives. Instead, the poet, wearing his cape, continued to prowl into solitude, intoning inscrutable stanzas as halfbacks and tackles made out Friday nights after football on sofas in dark-walled rec rooms with magnanimous cheerleaders. But decades later, when the dead have stopped blathering about olives, obese halfbacks wheeze upstairs to sleep beside cheerleaders waiting for hip replacements, while a lascivious, doddering poet, his burning eyes deep-set in wrinkles, cavorts with their daughters.